Welcome to week 8, I think it is. This week I'm going to talk about public expenditure and taxation in the UK, the wider system of the way in which British government raises its money and spends it. And what I want to do is to do the following things, really. I want to look very briefly at the history and development of public budgeting and public expenditure planning in the UK, at the political context of budgeting, including the key actors and roles and processes involved, current challenges and problems with the budgetary and spending processes, and then briefly at the end some comparative perspectives on budgeting and a look at some of the political science research that's been undertaken into the impact of legislation or legislative bodies on the budgeting process. You might think in a developed democracy that Parliament, that we heard a great deal about in previous weeks, would have a key role in the process that I'm going to talk about. Well, at a risk of getting through the lecture quickly, they don't. Or as you'll see, they do, but it's more formal than in reality. But I don't want to give away the whole story before we get there. So let's just begin with a bit of history. And every week we come back to history to some degree in trying to put together this picture of the way the British state operates, the way it and its institutions function. And of course, early government was much less sophisticated than it is today. It operated, if you think about it, I was struck by this myself, to wonder how government operated when it took days to get from one part of the country to another, and how ties operated between the aristocracy and the monarchy, which variously was located in London or Winchester. And of course, once you start asking those questions, the issues of how taxation was set, collected, and how much you could reasonably expect to collect from a population which was frankly didn't have a large middle class or a large working population with lots of paperwork to help you work it. Anyway, if you look at the evolution of government and its need for resources, the earliest records you can find in Britain, in England as it then was, the first mention of what was called appropriation, i.e. the use of resources. You're going to hear some words that are antique today, like appropriation and supply, but I'll explain these as I go along. The appropriation, i.e. the need for the government for resources, in this case the monarchy, can be traced in Britain as far back as 1340. But the more recently, not much more recently, you can find evidence of the evolution of the civil list. Effectively, the civil list existed in Britain until actually very recently. But in 1698, a formal civil list was identified as a way of appropriating money for the funding of the civil government and the royal household, which at this time were, similar, more analogously similar things than they are today. Public construction policies were undertaken, to wit, things such as the building of royal palaces. Most importantly, from time to time, governments wanted to conduct wars, and that required the funding of armies and navies. That, of course, was a primary driver of the need for resources in the early evolution of government. This is not by any means, by the way, supposed to be a history of British government. It is simply giving you a taster of the development over time of the need for resources for things such as the royal household, the construction of palaces, the fighting of wars, all these things that governments were most interested in the past, certainly more interested in the past than they've subsequently become in subsidies as things such as welfare. And of course, occasionally the need for subsidies or patronage for particular purposes. So a number of origins deep in the history of government about the need for expenditure for particular purposes. And the revenues to fund such government as there was, as British government evolved, could come from levies on trade and markets. If you look at the history of the City of London, when King William the Conqueror arrived and thereafter in 1066, He abstracted levies from the City of London, taxes and levies on effectively commerce in the city, so what would be seen as analogous to corporation tax today. Again, this is not a complete history of Britain and taxation. I'm just get on to it just as a way of giving you a flavour of what happened. In 1601, famously, a poor law was introduced requiring parishes to provide very basic, and it would have been basic, provision for the poor. I mean, not exactly the welfare system we know today, but funded from a property tax, which had had its origins well before that. Property taxes in this country have their origins in the 13th and 14th century and have to do with the need for common provision in villages and towns to provide ditches and protection. Stamp duty, a brilliant idea invented by some wizard in government to effectively put a stamp on a document for which you had to be paid. The document, say newspapers at some points, couldn't be sold without a stamp on them. So stamp duty, it exists to today in a formal way in the deeds that are passed in the sale of housing and elsewhere, and indeed at some points on stocks and shares. Duties on commodities. Now these were popular in the colonies, and Americans among you will know that the attempt to tax tea in the United States can be seen for and of itself as a trigger, and a significant trigger, in the decision of the United States to become an independent country. There were from time to time poll taxes. In the distant past, I've written a book about the poll tax, the one that was introduced in Britain in 1989 and 90. These were per capita taxes, rather attractive in their way, never very popular in their way, in that you could just pay so much of tax per individual person. Taxes on windows, you'll here and there in London still today see windows that are bricked up, from the fascinating idea that somebody had at some point of taxing windows, which just led, in the best traditions of modern tax evasion, to people bricking up windows. Taxes on alcohol, surprise, surprise. Whiskey taxes in the 19th century were used in part to fund prisons. And then income tax, which, as you'll see a bit later on, is by far the biggest tax with national insurance contributions that we have today, really only dates back to 1842. There was a brief effort previously to have an income tax. Income taxes, of course, if you think about it, require a substantial number of people with income, and indeed identifiable income, and a system of taxation to run it. Rather more difficult today, as then, I might add, than property taxes or even a poll tax to operate. And at the local level, talking about local government last week, the poor law property tax that started in 1601 evolved in the 19th century into a more general property tax, originally set by parishes but then by city and other local government. So again, this is not supposed to be a history of taxation in the way that wasn't a history of government. Simply to give you a sense that as the state, the royal household and then the state developed, it needed to provide services of various kinds, minimal it must be said originally, and these required some form of common approach to the public, particularly those with income, to raise money to fund the services concerned. Now, what about modern budgeting? What is the budget? What is a budget? Well, I've taken a quote here from an LSE colleague, Joachim Werner, who wrote a book about the budgetary process back in 2010, and I'll come back to this a bit later, in which he said that in most countries, the term budget refers to the annual expenditure and revenue plans tabled in the legislature. The legislature we've heard about in the earlier weeks about Parliament. So it's an annual, and in fact though, I think in Britain, the budget is more normally associated with revenue plans that need to raise taxation, although they do include, and I'll show you this later on, expenditure plans besides. These are ubiquitous, budgets that is, in democratic governments across the world. In fact, if you think about it, the entire basis of government really is the capacity to raise resources and then to use them. The entire notion of the state as it functions in the modern world has at its basis the mildly, you might say, and others think it's more mildly than others, coercive power to take money away within the rule of law and then use it for the purposes of the state. So democratic governments, mostly, or pretty well all governments, one way or another, will have budgets that involve raising and spending public resources. Principle of parliamentary consent to taxation can be seen to have gained constitutional recognition in this country as far back as 1215 in the publication of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a document signed by the King, King John, and the barons of England at the time in the matter of constraining, mildly, the monarch's power. But they contained within that document, written all that time ago, the notion that Parliament would consent to taxes the king wished to raise. So you can see the origins of the Crown having the consent of Parliament way back then, and we're back in the world of the Constitution that we held from Martin Lachlan in week 3. Now, how does this work in the modern UK government? Well, in the modern UK government, the Treasury, the Department of State, enjoys powers that were inherited from the Crown, especially in relation to appropriations, that is, the raising and use of resources. Now, that's that word appropriations. We'll hear more about that. The Cabinet, which of course, whose ministers are members of the government, the executive, has a powerful role in determining the annual budget, because although the Treasury is the formal department that operates with the Chancellor of the Exchequer at its head, the financing, the taxation of Britain and the divvying up of public expenditure, it is of course the Cabinet, consisting of members which includes the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that determines the overall shape of the budget. So should the British government spend more or less? Should the British government try to reduce the deficit? And we'll see more about the deficit later, or not. These are decisions that are made by the Prime Minister, Cabinet members, and then the Chancellor of the Exchequer will enact that using the Treasury as the government department, which has the management role for the economy. Powers of the House of Commons in relation to voting on the budget are limited by standing orders. Standing orders are the House of Commons' own rules. A very interesting example of which there are many in British government and politics, of the House of Commons, a sovereign legislature, of which we've heard more in previous weeks, setting its own rules, limiting its powers in relation to the management of the overall taxation of the country. And you'll see how important that is. Parliament is sovereign. It could decide to have enormous powers over the control of taxation and spending. In a way, for example, the United States Congress, and we've seen this demonstrated in real time recently, has. But actually, it sets its own standing orders, its own rules to constrain what it does. Now, we'll come back to this a bit later. I think in some ways this has to do with the fact that the House of Commons would prefer to debate things other than the detail of taxation and spending at a very high level. And if you see the documents that are produced to do this, you can see why they might come to that conclusion. The House of Lords cannot vote on legislation concerned with public money. This has to do with legislation passed in the early part of the 20th century after a constitutional crisis. So it does not vote on the budget at all, though it does hold a debate. And so that's not unique only to this, actually, to all matters that are to do with public money. The House of Lords is not part of the legislature in the sense that it does not vote on, I should say, the budget debate and the government's budgeting and taxation decisions. It holds a debate, but it can't vote and stop the House of Commons. The role of Parliament in all of this reflects the historic relationship with the Crown, remembering what I said about the Magna Carta a moment ago, where the sovereign sought approval and authority of Parliament to raise taxes for expenditure. But it's the Crown, again, this goes back to what Martin Lachlan was saying, the Crown, here represented by the Cabinet and the Treasury, which proposes taxation and expenditure. You might argue the other way around, expenditure and the taxation to fund it. But it's not Parliament that does that. Parliament has a role, which I'll explain in a moment, but it is not Parliament that is the initiator in all of this. Devolution, and indeed major public announcement about Scotland and devolution today, devolution has meant that in Scotland and Wales, and indeed in Northern Ireland, that they have their own devolved budgetary processes, as I touched on last week, and in effect the money handed across to them through the so-called Barnett formula, which I talked about, is now used within Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland in a way that is analogous to what I'm going to say. It is rather different, and there are different processes, but that money is now very much in their hands by a sovereign decision made in London by the UK government, but as you'll see in a moment, not heavily discussed by the UK Parliament. Now, there is a principle of annuality, i.e. it happens every year, for the supply, i.e. this is a technical term used in parliamentary debates, parliamentary language. So the supply, that is the provision of money in simple English, and that this is explicit in law. So there is a legal basis to the idea of an annual cycle of budgeting and the supply of resources to the government. The specific provision for expenditure that this gives through parliamentary processes, government introduces, Parliament then votes on it, is for a specified financial year only. And there is a principle of universality, that is, all revenues and expenditures are included in budget-related documents, though it's not embedded in legislation, though in practice this is how it operates. So there isn't a law saying that all revenues and expenditures must go through the process that I'm about to discuss, though in principle that's how it operates. Again, a very British way in this unwritten constitution, that you can have effectively embedded practices and rules, but ones that are not laid out in a constitution or any sort of formal underpinning document. Separate laws and legal processes are used to approve the annual revenue expenditure estimates. This is not done in a single process, and Parliament does not go into detail. There isn't a specificity in what Parliament can vote on. So Parliament can't go into every line of the government's budget in terms of, it can with taxation to some extent, but it definitely can't with expenditure. So Parliament, as far as spending is concerned, approves only very broad aggregates, and they are very broad indeed, as you'll see in a moment. So the role of Parliament is limited extraordinarily when it comes to expenditure, and to a significant degree when it comes to raising public money through taxation. So who are the key actors in this process? Well, you might say the Queen, as in everything, the Crown, is the head of state, and in a sense all the activities of government are undertaken in the name of the Crown. That includes the executive and indeed the civil servants acting for the government of the day. The Prime Minister in this activity, as in all others, has wide informal powers and has by right, or it's by convention actually, can appoint and dismiss ministers. This is a very big power, which is accepted by convention. Whoever wins the general election, there's a Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, by convention, can appoint and dismiss ministers, and you see this at reshuffles, the beginning of governments as well. Treasury, like other parts of the cabinet and the core of government, derives its power from royal prerogative. So this is the Crown acting, government acting as the Crown. And in the British system, what would in almost any other country be called a finance minister is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So a member of the government, therefore acting as the Crown, like the Prime Minister. And as we've seen in earlier weeks, civil servants work to deliver government policy. So the Chancellor heads the Treasury, but the Treasury is filled with non-political civil servants who will deliver government policy, cascading it out to other departments as well, where they're spending departments. Each Department of State, as we've seen in earlier weeks, is headed by a senior civil servant, the permanent secretary, who is also, in each department, the accounting officer, a formal title, accounting officer, for each department's use of resources. So you've got a Treasury in the middle of government, making major decisions about taxation and negotiating, as you'll see in a minute, about the distribution of resources. But when the money ends up in government departments, including in the Treasury itself, I might say, their permanent secretary has to account for the use of the money. And they do that publicly from time to time in front of the Public Accounts Committee, which is the senior committee of the House of Commons charged with overseeing government activity. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, overseeing and auditing. Now, the processes of budgeting, and again, there's a sort of chicken and egg issue here, but I'm going to start with expenditure. You might say you wouldn't need taxation if there were no expenditure. The process begins each year with the Chancellor's annual financial statement and budget report. That's the thing that looks like that. Very interesting. If you look at it online, you can go through all 190 pages of it, and I think no, that was something else. I'll come back to that. So the budget, usually produced with some ceremony in March or immediately after a general election. The British, those of you born and brought up in Britain will be aware of the weird ceremony where the Chancellor appears on the door the doorstep of number 11 Downing Street with a battered red box, holds it up with the secrets of the budget in it, and then goes to the House of Commons and by convention stands, I think by convention, drinking a glass of whiskey actually or something, at the dispatch box and gives the speech, and then the Leader of the Opposition responds by convention. That's all part of a kind of another of these processes of the way the British government system operates. Now, of course, it doesn't start then, it starts before then. It'll be going on now for next March, and indeed, in the next few weeks, you'll see that there is an autumn statement, which is now like an autumn budget. So what I'm saying here has to be qualified by the fact that there's a pre-budget budget every autumn, which gives us a clue as to what will happen next March, and indeed often includes details of changes in taxation and spending as if it were a budget. So qualify what I'm saying by that. The budget determines the overall tax take each year, so the total amount the government's going to collect in taxes, and the rates for each tax, whether income tax rates are going to go up or down, whether the 50p tax rate should be reduced to 45p or not, as indeed it has been by the present government. I think the Conservative part of the government would like to take it down to 40. The Labour Party criticises the government for having cut it from 50 to 40. So it's that kind of decision, whether corporation tax on businesses should go up or down, that sort of thing. All of this is now subject to oversight by the Office for Budget Responsibility. The OBR is a new body set up by George Osborne, independent of government, and that's designed to look at the government's forecast for the economy, for tax take, for spending and so on, and judge whether the government's figures really add up. The OBR is very important. Its website is full of extraordinarily useful documents about what the government's up to, but viewed slightly independently of government. After this budget, there is a period in which a finance bill is introduced into Parliament, into the House of Commons, of course, and this allows parliamentary scrutiny. It goes through the normal processes of Parliament, introduced as legislation, then there's a committee that looks at it in the normal committee stage process, where it's possible to put down amendments. Though this is circumscribed. Parliamentary approval for expenditure, by the standing orders I should say that I mentioned earlier, parliamentary approval for expenditure is then delivered through a supply process, where supply estimates are published in line with the government's spending review, which takes place periodically, and those supply estimates give totals of the amount the government's going to spend on each department and in broad subheads within each department, and these can be revised in mid-year in what are perhaps not surprisingly called supplementary estimates. So you've got a parliamentary process for spending to examine the tax measures every year, and the setting and publication of supply estimates to describe how the government's going to spend the money raised in that exercise. Now, this was an almost entirely unreadable, but it doesn't matter. It will be almost unreadable when you look at this on Moodle. These are the supply estimates, but what we've got here is for the Department for Education, sort of top-line spending figures of 53-ish billion, declining to 51 to 50, interesting. It's the other way around, actually. Going up from 50 to 51 to 53, and then some very broad subheads. So this is details about what the government's going to spend, and then some details about expenditure on pensions and capital, but at a pretty high level. This is one of these figures is for £53 billion. There's a lot of spending going on within that, a lot of money going to individual schools and so on. Now, the legal authority for government expenditure is given through what are called Appropriation Acts, and there's a title that goes back way into history, and by the even more historic sounding Consolidated Fund Act. Now, I know I'm not supposed to say this in a lecture, but just get the broad drift of this. This is parliamentary procedure beyond which many, I think, MPs would struggle a bit, with due respect to them. That is, they debate these things, but it's not something they kind of think and worry about in the way they might worry about reform of schools or reform of prisons or something. So they get this formal legal authority for the government spending plans through the Appropriation Acts and the Consolidated Fund Act. The Appropriation Acts give legal force to the estimates I had up a moment ago, and the Consolidated Fund Act authorises a single sum of money for the supply of resources for government expenditure. So it's effectively adding all of this up together, saying there's a single number here which we, Parliament, allow you, the government, the executive, this is the legislature, allowing the executive to spend. These acts are voted without debate. Now, there are debates associated with these things, but they're not on the detail of all of these figures. They are used. It's a formality. So it's not really a true budgetary process where MPs are going through line by line, looking at all of these spending figures. What happens is there are debates, but they're generally used for the opposition or for just general debates in the House of Commons, and are rarely linked to the government's financial proposals laid out in the supply estimates. That's why I said don't try to think too hard about it. Now, this is you might think this is a bit odd, because what I'm trying to describe here in a fairly formal way is the publication of lots of numbers, or first the finance bill, which is a proper process as the budget goes through the House of Commons, but that's all about changing tax rates. And the government has a majority, remember, which it can generally enforce its view as it does that. When it comes to spending the money, I've described a process of supply estimates, Appropriation Acts, and the Consolidated Fund Act, but actually the debates on these are used by MPs for entirely different purposes. And of course, constitutional practice dictates the House of Commons can't propose increases to estimates or indeed transfers within budget heads. So if we go back to that, you might think, well, if we were the Congress in the United States, and we've seen this done recently, we might think money should be moved around that. Well, they can't. By the House of Commons' own standing orders impede it from doing this. So here we have a sovereign Parliament, sovereign House of Commons, in effect having its own standing orders in order to constrain its own capacity to make changes to these spending figures. They could be rejected, but that would be a nuclear option. And of course, any government, and remember what George Jones was saying about how Parliament operates, it's his view, but actually I think in this sense it's true, that the government wouldn't introduce proposals to Parliament on most occasions if it thought it wasn't going to get its majority, in a majoritarian system, to vote them through. And lo and behold, when it comes to the supply estimates, the government majority will always be wheeled out to push through the government spending figures of the day. Having said that, there's been an innovation by parliamentary standards in modern times, very recently, to allow departmental select committees to consider estimates. So each department has estimates, slightly bigger than the document, the page I put up there a moment ago, and those are considered by select committees. So I think it's fair to say that these committees, which each one shadows a department, Education Committee shadows the Education Department, Health, and so on. I think it'd be fair to say that of all the things that select committees do, looking at the estimates, all these detailed figures of spending, which anyway the government has used its majority to push through, is probably not the key and most interesting thing the select committee does every year. In a helpful document published by the Hansard Society, its authors say, and I quote, 99.9% of government spending is passed without even the pretense of a formal debate. And I just say again, think about that in the context of Congress. I'm going to say more about the United States in a sort of comparative way towards the end. But just think about that as a way of doing it. So despite all the powers invested in the House of Commons and its sovereignty, in fact, the government, the executive line, is pushed through this process by precedent. This is the way the House of Commons has chosen to allow the system to operate. And as I implied earlier, I think members of Parliament would prefer to use their time on what are called opposition days or supply days, when they can have a vote, have a debate on something they consider important, not on all these estimates. So it's very important to get the difference between what looks like a real process and what is actually a formality. What you might say, why have I spent 20 minutes talking to you about this? Just to make the point, and I'll come back to this at the end. It is a formality, but it's important that the legislature chooses to operate like this in relation to the executive. Now, it's worth saying there are other important processes. There are government spending reviews, and it's of course the spending review that creates the overall totals of spending for 3 years at a time, which become the basis of the government's annual decisions, which are fed into these supply estimates. So if you look on gov.uk, the government's website, you can find spending reviews. There was one published earlier this year. They're generally published every 2 years and for a 3-year period into the future, 3 or 4 years into the future. And they're determined by negotiations between the Treasury and all other departments. So this is a huge exercise in divvying up the overall total of public expenditure. Now, there are different ways of doing this, and a number of books have been written about the way in which one might do this, starting with, as it were, zero-based budgets, or just starting with last year, plus or minus a bit. I have to say, given the way in which history and last year's expenditure creates dependency on the past, an incredibly powerful need to sustain what was done last year if you're in health or education or any other part of government, then negotiations between the Treasury and other government departments for the future are going to be very, very heavily determined by the past, subject to government-wide decisions about, for example, at the last general election, the Conservative Party decided that it would, if it won office, maintain spending on health in real terms. It would put up spending on international development in real terms. Those priorities, which went into an election manifesto, fed their way through into spending reviews. But of course the government, as we'll come on to this in a moment, also decided that it was going to cut the deficit. And if it's going to cut the deficit while sustaining spending on health and other items, that meant that some items within the government's budget had to be cut far faster, relatively, in order to deliver the overall spending total. So all of those negotiations go on in advance of these spending reviews, and you'll get lots of leaks in the papers as ministers leak that their department's been cutting hardest and the wicked Treasury must be brought to heel. And this happened earlier this year about defence, if you remember all of that. So it's a negotiation process within government. And then when it's set, the review becomes the basis of annual decisions about spending, which feed their way through those supply estimates. If you want to look backwards at what the government's done, there's a very helpful document called Public Expenditure Statistical Analyses. I'll say no more than that. It's simply a very useful compendium of everything the British government does. And last but not least, each department of government produces an annual report to a sort of broadly consistent framework, certainly for spending, and that outlines the policies, aims and objectives of each department, and also looks at expenditure on major elements of policy. Expenditure on major elements of expenditure, it must be on services. My mistake. this is what middle of those things, the public expenditure statistical analyses, looks like. So this is almost unreadable too, but you get pages and pages looking at each department and what they've spent back over 5 or 6 years backwards, and possibly 1 or 2 years into the future. Helpful, but though you do have to be careful in looking at these, that things move from column to column from year to year, and so although they are all presented in cash, they are nevertheless prone to one-off changes that will distort the figures from year to year, but a useful document. How is the government audited? Government spends £720 billion a year at the moment, UK government, out of a UK GDP of about 1.5 trillion, 1,500 billion. So about 45% of the economy is in the public sector, a substantial amount of money spent by individual departments, as you'll see in a moment. Well, there is an established audit function. It was originally created in anything like its current form in the 19th century. At that time, Gladstone, who was a Liberal Prime Minister, created the Exchequer and Audit Department. And that has sustained itself all the way through to today, though its name is now changed. It's called the National Audit Office, headed by the Controller and Auditor General, CNAG. This institution produces an array of reports, year in, year out, about government spending, looking backwards. It is the one that discovers things like, fire communication systems bought by the Department for, I think it was Communities and Local Government, for the fire service, where all £450 million had to be written off out of 450 million without anything ever being purchased or delivered. Not bad, eh? And this is the department that looks at defence procurement, NHS IT systems, and all of these other things. Not all of which go wrong, in fairness, some of which are fascinating to read about. Crucially, the Controller and Auditor General and the NAO, crucially, the CNAG is an officer of Parliament. So this audit process is not undertaken by an arm of government. So the government is looked at by an independent agency which answers to Parliament and gets its resources voted by Parliament. So this is a parliamentary backward-looking check on expenditure by government. And this is a useful example of so it's not exactly the separation of powers within Britain, but it's an example of the way the system has developed in this country. So the CNAG cannot be told by government ministers what to do, because he, and they are generally he, I think they've always been he, are officers of Parliament and therefore cannot have their resources cut by the government. Now, it's true, of course, the government has a majority in Parliament, but by convention, the CNAG is an independent creature. I should say the CNAG, and I'll come back to this actually, but reports into the Public Accounts Committee, and the Public Accounts Committee, the senior committee of the House of Commons, has a chair who is drawn from the opposition. So it reinforces this capacity of a backward look at public spending by the government to be looked at reasonably independently, but from within the overall British political system and government system. Now, if we look at British public expenditure over the long term, and I'm indebted to the Institute for Fiscal Studies for this chart, I've taken it straight from the work they've done. It doesn't quite come up to date, but that doesn't really matter. What I'm trying to make, the point I'm just trying to make here is that public expenditure at the beginning of the 20th century was 10 to 12% of the economy. Then there were two big spikes, the First World War and then the Second World War. In each case, you'll notice that the line continued after the war higher than it was before. That's a very revealing tendency, that war lifted in each case. And it's, this is not a function of this debate or this particular series to be certain about why that happened, but clearly the common endeavour and the social mixing that went on during wars had an impact on policy after them. It's most clear after the Second World War, when a Labour government was elected immediately after the war with commitments to improve housing and introduce the welfare state, and perhaps take on some of the socially mixed communal forms of government and activity that the war between 1939 and 45 had perforce introduced, by external means. Thereafter, if you run forward, you'll see that a trend line would see 40, roughly where public expenditure in Britain has levelled out. If we ran forward, and I'll come back to this in a moment, in fact, latterly, with the shrinkage of the economy after the recession from the recession of 2008, public spending as a share of the economy rose substantially to around 50% of GDP, but it's fallen back again since then. So in the long term, the government has grown. That's all you really need to know from this chart. Government has grown from around 10 to 12% of GDP. It would have been less in the 19th century, and now up to typically 40 or more % of GDP. If you look at growth since the 1940s, what you've got here is on the blue line, that's just real public expenditure, rising from year to year in billions. So as the economy grows, public spending grows. Nothing surprising about that. As we get richer as a society, we spend more on the public sector. And that as a share of GDP varies substantially. And you can pick out things why politics does matter. So if we go in this chart to about 1980, see where 1980 was. About here. So there was a jump. Mrs. Thatcher becomes Prime Minister, and there's a jump. But that's because the economy went into a relatively sharp recession after 1979. So public spending, even though it was cut, grew as a share of GDP. And then thereafter, the Thatcher government substantially reduced public expenditure. You can see it tumbling a long way from if you look at it on that axis, I should say, from just under 50% of GDP, in about 48% of GDP in about 1981, all the way down to under 40%. Now, let it never be said that voting doesn't have an impact. And thereafter, if we come forward a bit to the last bit, where after 1999-2000, the Blair-Brown government takes it all the way back up again. Now, some of it at the end is because of the impact of the recession, but you can see how changing governments has an effect. And if we run this forward, you'd see it's going to fall again. In fact, George Osborne is committed to reducing this back to around 39% of GDP. So voting does make a difference. It's not only voting, of course, external sort of forces contribute to this as well, but you can see it's quite a rocky path for public spending as a share of GDP, if not in real terms. Where's the money spent? Now, this is a matter of profound influence to British public debate. The biggest single item of public expenditure now, and I'm going to of about 700 billion, a quarter of it goes to social security. This is pensions, which is about half of it, pensions for the elderly, out of work benefits, sickness benefits, long-term sickness benefits, and so on. Over a quarter. Now that is a very substantial growth consistently over a long time. This kind of welfare state started in its modern form really after 1945, in the late 1940s, and so now we've got welfare as the biggest chunk, followed by the 18% chunk there, the National Health Service. That's grown substantially similarly since the end of the Second World War, and I'll show you this in a moment. Third chunk is education. So we've now got social security, the NHS and education are taking between them 27, 45, 55, nearly 60%. Now those have all been growing during the present government's life. The NHS and schools, at least within education, because the government committed itself to at least hold them in real terms, but welfare, because the recession pushed up the number of people who are unemployed, for example, and created other drivers to push the welfare budget up. Now, as the present government wanted to flatten or cut public spending in real terms, but protected those three items and indeed international Britain's international development budget as well, you can see how the rest of spending has been put under pressure since the government took office. So that's pretty well everything else: capital, transport, housing, recreation, environmental protection, local government and capital predominantly. So this is a pattern which is very fixed, and actually there's a problem arguably buried in this pattern, and it's this, that the public, shown by public opinion polls, is hugely supportive of spending on the NHS and education. If you ask in opinion polls, and there's easily accessible poll data that says this, people will say more should be spent on the NHS, more should be spent on schools. It's true with the welfare budget, they're much less enthusiastic, although opinion's been changing there at the margins latterly. But given the automatic growth of the welfare budget, particularly when there's a recession going on, it's quite difficult for governments to squeeze all of that, even if they want to. And the difficulty is that it's proved harder for government to raise taxes than to raise expenditure. Perhaps not surprisingly, the government wants higher levels of spending rather more than it wants higher taxes, or at least that's what politicians have inferred from what we say and how we vote. If we look at spending by department, it's pretty clear from what I've said that it would look like this. These are all taken from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, these extremely beautifully drawn charts, I might say, and they're credited. Health, biggest department, children, schools and families, now called education. Defence. Now, defence is interesting. If we'd looked at this chart in 1948, defence would have been as big as health is now, and health would have been as big as defence is now. So over that period, the British state has radically redistributed money from defence spending, as Britain's global role has fallen away and declined and changed, to health. And defence continues to shrink, as I'll show you this in a moment. And then it's clear this is a reflection of what we saw earlier. It's interesting just to see, by the way, how small some of the departments we hear most about, like here's culture, media and sports, which contains arts and sports funding. Hear a lot about those in the media, but they are very small. International development, which has increased a lot. Now when it says, by the way, capital and resource, capital is investment, resources broadly day-to-day spending. Anyway, you can see the pattern, which are the big departments. Wealth, so health, education, defence, these are big departments of state with powerful ministers. They're like governments in their own right, they're so powerful. Now, this is something I pointed to a moment ago. This is partly an Institute for Fiscal Studies table, IFS, wonderful documents on all of these subjects. Partly new ones I've added for the last column on a slightly different basis. So don't read, they're nearly comparable, but not precisely comparable. And what you see here is that social security, which in 1958-9 was 6% of GDP, or equivalent to 6% of GDP, has now reached 15 or 16%. Now it's 27% of public spending, that was of public expenditure on the earlier pie chart, but you can see how enormously that's grown. The NHS has gone from 3.2% to nearly 8%. Defence, on the other hand, or education, 3 to nearly 6. Defence down from 6.4 to 2.3. So, and if we'd had lots of smaller things, they too would have declined over time. They have to, in order to make the overall thing not the total managed expenditure here, which is total public expenditure really, not rise too much. So we've got changing patterns. So we not only have, Mrs. Thatcher's government and Mr. Blair's government changing changing the scale of public spending, successive governments, regardless of policy and politics, I should say, regardless of politics, shifting public spending towards welfare services and away from particularly defence, but also capital investment. Now this just puts the UK in context. This is a table taken from the OECD's excellent statistics available to LSE students and staff. Marvellous collection of revenue statistics on the OECD's website. And this looks at public expenditure as a proportion of GDP. The United Kingdom is there. about 50% in 2009. It's fallen somewhat since then. On the higher side lie Denmark, Finland, France, Sweden, perhaps not surprisingly, Greece, perhaps not surprisingly, though it'll have fallen since then, Italy. And then on the lower side, you'll find countries significantly further down. Japan, way down on the other side there, and even after all the expansion in recent years. The United States is here. So, different models. Scandinavian model, bigger state generally. France, soon France will actually be the top of this table, interestingly. France is growing. Its state is still growing. Whereas the UK, which would have been, and you can see on this chart where it was actually in 2007 and 2000, in 2000, the UK was down here. It's grown, but the current government is taking it back down. So the UK, although all countries are moving that way, or many are moving that way at the moment, except France, Britain is also moving that direction as well now. What are the major taxes that are raised? If you go back to the finance bill process I was describing earlier, well, income tax and national insurance, which is effectively a form of, not quite income tax, but was originally intended to be, as its name suggests, something we all paid in exchange for getting pensions and other forms of social security, now in effect part of income tax, or very nearly so. So 260 billion raised from those forms of broadly income-related taxes, value-added tax, 103, company tax, corporation tax, much in the news recently, modest, 39 billion, very difficult to chase that across international borders, we've discussed. Council tax, which for most people in Britain is the tax people pay on their homes, property tax, seen as hugely important and gets more coverage in public debate than all these other taxes put together, is actually raising 27 billion. So it's actually 5% of taxation. But it's the one that is most discussed because it's so visible. Fuel duties, again, these are duties on fuel rather than what the fuel companies charge. So that's the total revenue. And that's what total expenditure was. And again, you won't be able to read it, but why should you on this? But the equivalent figure for spending is around 720. This is taken out of the government's budget document, actually, the red thing I showed you earlier. So the deficit is the gap. Forgive me, this is a bit Janet and John, but it's the way the government does it, really. The deficit's the gap between these two figures. So the 720 billion figure for spending, 587 for taxes, with some adjustments, which we won't trouble ourselves with now, leaves you with a deficit this year of around 110 billion. So that's the government's deficit. Every pound of that adds to the UK's national debt, which has to be serviced over time. This is why George Osborne, and indeed, in fairness, the opposition are committed to shrinking this figure at different speeds, it must be said, between government and opposition, because it adds to government debt, and that in turn effectively taxes the future. So all of this will have to be paid back in the future, and it obviously will compete with future spending, the charges on repaying, the interest charges on repaying the principal on this debt. Now, there's a big argument, and I'm not going to go into this today, about the speed with which the deficit is reduced. The government set its plan A, it's going to do this in this way, originally going to reduce the deficit to zero by 2015-16, now it looks likely to be 2019. Whereas the Labour Party has at all points said it would do it somewhat slower. It would reduce the deficit, but at a more slow pace, thus allowing more growth, which they hope would then reduce it even faster. Well, we'll never know. That's a counterfactual you can't test because we only have one government at a time. Now, if we look, we're nearly coming to the end here, a traditional analysis of this Treasury spending and budgeting process. There was a study done in the 1970s by Hecklo and Wildavsky, who wrote a study based on interviews with people working in Whitehall. It was a very well-known study at the time, but others did similar work soon after, though in different ways. This was called the Private Government of Public Money. And Heckler and Wildavsky argued that there was a powerful relationship between the Treasury and spending departments within what it called a Whitehall village. That the way the British state operated in central government, that the people working inside the system, whether they were in the Treasury or the spending departments, had powerful values and norms in common. And indeed, that civil servants, they wrote, were not just loyal to the department they were in, but to the civil service, to the Crown, in effect, going back to the Crown, and that they prized coherence and continuity. This is the argument that effectively sets the civil service up as a constitutional entity, a body in its own right, an actor in its own kind. And that this acted as a powerful way of understanding the way the system operated, which in its way is consistent with the sort of constitutionally precedent-laden way in which Britain does so much of its government and politics. Now, a contemporary analysis of the UK in an international context, this is taken from a very helpful OECD journal published a few years ago. What this does is to look at countries which have a written constitution. There's a set of ways in which their budgeting processes work. And then over there, on the far side, what happens in countries with an unwritten constitution, of which the two they cite here are the New Zealand and the United Kingdom, where the unwritten constitution leads to a series of budget laws, no framework law or an organic constitutional budget law of the kind found in, not in all, but in some other countries. Then, going back to what I was saying earlier, standing orders of Parliament that constrain Parliament volunteering through its own rules, very rules-based, constraining its own approach to particularly decisions about budgeting, but frankly also with heavy precedent-based rules about budget changes anyway, and anyway the government has a majority to do that as well. And then a number of executive regulations about how the resources are used. Now that's the UK system. Contrasting substantially, I'm not going to go through all of these, with these other systems described here. What I do want to say a bit more, though, is just to compare the United States and the UK, again derived from this OECD piece of work, which effectively looks at the UK system in the way I've just described it, and that's in this first column, and then compares that with what goes on in the United States. So in Britain, in the United Kingdom, the Treasury produces a draft budget, as I described. The Cabinet approves it, subject to government-decided rules on fiscal aggregates, as I described that, but will not be challenged by Parliament, it says in this OECD document, reinforcing, I hope, what I was saying earlier. Compare that in the United States, where the Office of Management and Budget, which is a presidential agency, prepares a draft budget, and the executive can propose a medium-term strategy if it wants, but it's not binding on Congress, which has unlimited power to adopt its own fiscal strategy. So we're now in a system which we're not studying, but which has a formal separation of powers, and which operates in this extraordinarily different way. And once we hop forward, I'll just hop forward to what it says here about the legislature. In the UK, does the legislature consider the budget in committees? Well, yes, but only in the House of Commons. Most committees take little interest in the draft budget, mainly because any proposals for substantial changes are unlikely to be adopted. Such proposals are vetted by the House of Commons Liaison Committee, and only 3 days of debate are allowed in plenary session. Whereas in the United States, budget committees of both the House of Representatives and the Senate first agree on a budget resolution which could propose fiscal aggregates quite different from those presented by the President. Subsequently, appropriation subcommittees may alter the budget programme substantially. Now, of course, we have just seen, a few weeks ago, this played out in real time, as we have before in the United States. Separation of powers, with Congress with its extraordinary power to effectively block the executive, block the President's budget. In the UK, zero chance of this happening. It's never happened in my own lifetime. I think it's ever happened in modern times. A very, very different system. And this is a helpful chart that they've produced just after the table I've just shown you, which effectively creates a sort of fascinating, I think, set of arrows pointing up from looking at, on these axes, the strength of separation of executive and legislature, not very in Britain, as you can imagine, and the need to adopt a law for the budget system. And, you know, you can see in the corner here something approaching Britain, oddly enough, parliamentary monarchies with first past the post electoral system. Where do you think they had in mind when that? And then going on through parliamentary monarchies with coalition governments. Well, you know, we've moved in that way, but it hasn't changed. Britain, despite its coalition government, hasn't moved up that axis, that trajectory, I would argue, to semi-presidential systems and parliamentary republics onto presidential systems, where I suspect the creators of this imagine the United States would lie. So you can see from this that the UK lies in a system in the corner, really, of this graph because of relatively weak separation of the executive and legislature, which is further reinforced by the legislature's agreement to control its own powers, and very little, relatively little need to adopt law for the budget system. Again, it's just a formality, as I described. Now, finally, the last thing I'm going to say. Our colleague, Joachim Werner, who I mentioned at the beginning, has undertaken research onto the effects of legislative control. So the thing I've just been talking about. What he found was, and I quote, that legislative effects on public expenditures are largely driven by one particular variable. That is, the power of legislatures to amend the budget. In contrast, the number of other budget institutions highlighted in the literature do not appear significantly to affect the size of the budget. So it would appear that the British way of doing it that I've described, you know, in a sense where there isn't much power or virtually no power for legislatures to amend the budget, is one in which, other things being equal, you'd expect it to fit this description here. And he goes on to say, parliamentary control of the budget is difficult to attain if not elusive. That's a general remark, not only about Britain. Many national legislatures have neither the institutional means nor the political independence to be influential budgetary actors. So this is not as different from Britain as perhaps I was suggesting, but still different in a number of cases. Active legislative bodies, on the other hand, are prone to suffer from pro-spending bias. So if the Parliament in Britain could make changes, you can be absolutely sure it would be to increase spending. Well, you can't be absolutely sure, can you? But this work suggests it would be more likely that and there's a lot of complex research that underpins this finding in his book, which suggests that if you do allow legislatures, they'll tend to push spending and taxes up, not down. And then my last quote here is going back to the OECD journal that I quoted earlier on. They conclude that the executive branch, that's obviously the centre, the core of government, in this case, in Britain's case, the Crown, has two particularly important roles to play in the budget processes. First, it must prepare the initial draft of the annual budget, which definitely happens in the UK, which should set the context of a coherent medium-term financial strategy. Second, the executive is responsible for executing the annual budget and accounting to the legislature for budget implementation and result. And that is a precise description of what goes on in the United Kingdom. And so, if you are left with what you're left with here is a heavily executive-dominated budgeting and taxing system in the United Kingdom, in which legislature has a formal position which it has chosen and indeed constrained itself from using to a significant degree, and an executive, the Crown, Cabinet, Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister, who are enormously powerful in driving through the kind of public spending and tax policies that we have. Now, you might say, well, this is yet another piece of evidence about the way in which the majoritarian system that operates with first past the post operates in the United Kingdom, but it most certainly can be seen in that way. Now, that's why I'm going to stop after slightly more than an hour, which I went on 5 minutes longer than I'd intended, which I apologise. And now we've got a couple of questions. Cal.
So do you think the current process of budget negotiation, which involves the reformed Star Chamber, is an effective and efficient one?
Well, I didn't mention the Star Chamber, and it's a good thing that you did. The Star Chamber is a reference back to medieval England, really, but in the current management of public expenditure, it's effectively a way of brokering difficult decisions during the public expenditure planning process. So when spending reviews are taking place, it's a way of effectively a subgroup of the cabinet acting as arbitrators on decisions about, spending programs for individual departments as they feed through into the next 3 or 4 years worth of spending figures. I mean, it's proved an effective way of delivering a result. I mean, in the end, it slightly separates the Chancellor of the Exchequer from having to impose things. It creates a bargaining mechanism within the core of government. But it is worth stressing that it's within the core of government. It's not, in any sense, a process that is open at all to consideration by the legislature or indeed any public debate other than what's leaked directly into the newspapers. Whether you consider leaks directly into the newspapers as an element in the Constitution, I'm not sure, probably not. But it is increasingly used as a way of contributing to this kind of debate. So the Star Chamber process has, I think, been used by governments as a way of brokering often very fraught decisions about the final totals of public expenditure by departments. Could be done by other means. I mean, there are other things I haven't talked about really, such as mechanisms that have been discussed for the overall control of public expenditure. I mean, controlling the total. Is that a reasonable answer to the question? I mean, what you were hoping for? Yeah, good. Do you want to follow it up in any way?
Well, I guess slightly related question is the Secretaries of State have to bargain with the Treasury to get their individual budgets. So what do they actually have as sort of leverage in those negotiations?
Well, it's another great question, and time precluded me from explaining that in advance of a spending review, individual departments will, of course, which see themselves, although they wouldn't ever say it like this, as a sort of a lobby group. So if you're at the Department of Education or the Health Department or whichever department within government, or the Home Office, you're likely to see yourself as at least having to argue to protect your existing programmes or to fund existing programmes that you're committed for the future. But of course, behind that, out in civil society here, there will be an enormous amount of lobbying done by interests in advance of a spending review. So each department, and possibly the Treasury directly, will have received dozens, if not hundreds of documents from charities, local government, universities, everybody, about why more money should be spent on the arts, the universities, teaching this, sport, whatever. So there's an enormous process that lies behind the, as it were, the negotiations which, if they don't get resolved by agreement between individual ministers and the Treasury, end up in the Star Chamber. But in that sense, the lobby and the actors lobbying outside the government system are, to some extent, strengthening the arm of individual departments in their negotiations with government. So, an external body might well say, here we have a programme about how we can invest in public services to save money, and have given that to their department, say in a public health programme, and you can well imagine that the Ministry of Health, Department of Health, aided and abetted and armed with that research, might well indeed use that in its negotiations with the Treasury if it were compelling. So, I've simplified for the basis of, on the extent of the amount of time, really, the complexity and the many actors who play a part in this spending review process, and which bear down in the run-up to a spending review. Now, there'll be a general election in 2015, and immediately after that, there'll be another spending review. And as sure as night follows day, next year, 2014, everybody and their dog will be commissioning reports to put into both government and opposition in advance of the election, so that when the spending review happens in 2015, after the general election, they've got their work on the desks, at least, of the civil servants who will be there throughout the general election. Okay, there was another question, I think. Is there? No, right, okay. Well, let me open it out. Anybody else like to ask something or ask another question or make a comment on what we've heard today? Spending review process? Yes, please.
I think this is a point where you need to tell young people it's very important that they actually does vote, because it's very, very, very important.
Well, I think it's a very sensible remark, if I may say so. When I put up this slide, as I said at the time, you can only see, because you can see how different governments with different leaderships led to changes in the pattern of public expenditure. It would be very hard to argue that voting made no difference, or at least changes of government. And maybe in an individual election, your vote did not have an effect. And if you vote for some parties, it may never have an effect. I see that. And that will be discussed at later lectures. But you can see the impact of Mrs. Thatcher, whether you like her or don't like her. You can see Mrs. Thatcher's view of the world. And you can see how the Blair-Brown government also affected what happened. In fact, between that, there is a little peak on the run into the 1992 general election, which was the major government, interestingly, who, against all the odds, won the election. I'm not saying it's because of that rise in the run-up to the 1992 election, but there it is. That was partly, in fairness, an increase induced by a recession, a slowdown in the economy at the time. So you're right. I mean, there's no question that changes in government do lead through to changes in policy in relation to public expenditure. And you get a choice subsequently. And I mean, in the longer term, there was a period of consensus in the 50s. If you look at public spending as a share of GDP in the 1950s, which is sort of from about, it fell after the war, but from the end of the war onwards was a gentle increase at a time when the economy as a whole was growing. So yes, voting, I would rather agree with you. I think voting does make a difference. Any 5 more minutes? One more question? Oh, sorry, I couldn't. Forgive me.
Does the National Audit Office scrutinize spending by local councils?
Local authorities? Yes, well, that's another useful prompt to something that got cut because of the need for reasonable brevity. The National Audit Office and the Controller and Auditor General are, or have been traditionally, auditors of central government. So they audit central government departments. But the current government, and there had been since the early 1980s, a separate Audit Commission, which was an appointed body, so that was a government-appointed institution, though with an independent board. I have to admit, I once sat on the board of the Audit Commission many years ago. The Audit Commission existed to audit local government and local appointed bodies, so like parts of the NHS and some elements of schools. The current government, when it took office in 2010, abolished or decided immediately to abolish the Audit Commission and allow local authorities to appoint their own auditors without supervision. They'd have to produce annual reports, they'd be subject to the law in the normal way, but there would no longer be an Audit Commission overseeing the process. So that's the end of the Audit Commission. Although, in a slightly zombie-like way, the Audit Commission has proved more difficult to kill off than was at first expected. And so it does still exist in a much shrunk down way, still producing reports, but is likely finally to disappear in around 2015, so just about the time of the next election. As its responsibilities have been reduced, the National Audit Office, which was traditionally, as I say, an auditor only of central government spending, has had its remit increased somewhat to cover elements of what the Audit Commission would have done, or is now tapering down from doing. But there is a constitutional implication in doing that, and that's why the National Audit Office and the Controller and Auditor General have to step carefully. Because if you remember what I said, the CNAG and the National Audit Office are actually creatures of Parliament, which has its own electoral mandate. Local government has a separate electoral mandate. And having Parliament's auditors auditing local authorities that have their own electoral mandate might be thought to be some kind, in British terms, a constitutional confusion. And so the NAO has decided, as it were, to do very general oversight of local government, a little bit of work on whether things are being done with proper attention to value for money, a bit of oversight of whether or not the rules for probity are working, the new rules for ensuring councils, auditors are working effectively. But it won't be doing any of this in detail. It needs to keep some distance from the process. And I should add that in Scotland and Wales, there are separate audit arrangements which audit both the Scottish and Welsh government, or one in Scotland, one in Wales, audit the government and local government. So there's a separate arrangement for Scotland and Wales. So the NAO and the Controller and Auditor General, therefore, have a new responsibility for local government, but only a fairly limited and strategic, sort of high-level one. Matthew.
I was just wondering, in the British system, the way they currently have it arranged to manage the budget, or at least have very limited scrutiny of the budget, what are the normative defences offered for having that system? You mentioned lower levels of public expenditure, but it seems to me that the US, but I'm not sure the American students could tell us, probably have lower levels of public expenditure as a percentage of GDP in some of those categories, with the exception of defence. So are there other defences for the existing system offered as well?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not an expert on American government, but I think if we followed Joachim Werner here, active legislative bodies are prone to suffer from a pro-spending bias, he says. And I mean, so that would be pro-spending, other things being equal. So you're right, there are clearly within every society a number of norms and political expectations that, and he's very clear about this in the book actually, he's very clear that, of course, there are a number of historical, institutional and other determinants of an overall level of public expenditure, why Japan or the United States has a much lower level of public expenditure as a proportion of the economy than, say, the Scandinavians, Sweden and Norway, traditionally high, and there's a normative an expectation in those societies of a high degree of welfare provision paid for with higher taxes as part of a societal norm that kind of sees the world in a very different way to the United States and many Anglo-Saxon countries. So I suspect that the observation about active legislative bodies, A, is other things being equal, and B, of course, whether what happened in Congress recently bears out that finding, I'm not so sure. I think as I understood it from this side of the Atlantic, though it wasn't all about the levels of spending so much as the distribution and type of spending, it didn't look to me as if the legislature there was actually trying to push up spending compared with what the executive was attempting to do. But clearly, the wider norms in a society affect, as it were, the overall level of public spending as revealed by... I'm going to go and remember forward and backwards. These, if we looked across this at countries, and it doesn't quite, these are all the OECD countries, plus some that aren't actually on the far side there. But, no, they're not all in OECD yet. But you can see within, and all of these are not directly comparable, but you can see a pretty wide range and indeed clusters of countries, particularly the Nordics at this end, the Scandinavian countries at this end, and then the United States and others, and Japan nearer that end, but Switzerland's interestingly nearer that end. I mean, Switzerland this research I was quoting didn't look at this, but you'd have to, if you looked at this, you might think that unitary states came further up this end and federal ones further down that end, but I haven't exactly, I'm not aware whether there's research that tests that, though why do I think there probably is, whether federal states may make a difference as well. It's not a comparative exercise today. Well, it's just time for half a question if there is one. If not, thank you. It's just coming up to 6:30. Next week we will be looking at policy making, I think. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much. Good evening.